Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev delivered unexpected news to Russian President Vladimir Putin when it was reported that Dmitry Medvedev met with high-ranking American officials. Russian President Vladimir Putin was taken aback. Medvedev has achieved an agreement with America to depose Putin from the throne. The conflict between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev has reached new heights. Medvedev, Russia's long-serving president, has begun moves to dethrone Vladimir Putin, whose influence is beginning to wane. Medvedev, who hasn't been seen in public in a long time, apparently paid a secret visit to America. The question of why Medvedev, who had surprised Kremlin officials with his words, made some time after the Russian army invaded Ukrainian land, suddenly reversed sides, was beginning to pique people's interest. After U.S. officials revealed that Israel was secretly supplying ammunition support to the Ukrainian army, Medvedev's words surprised everyone. Following the U.S. confession, the Israeli government agreed to providing weapons support to Ukraine, but also maintained that the vast majority of these munitions belong to the U.S. The words were somewhat shocking given that Russia was anticipated to sharply criticize Israel's backing for Ukraine. Medvedev, a personal buddy of Vladimir Putin, was roundly chastised in the Kremlin for his actions, declaring that the countries that entered the battle would, of course, be allies and that Israel's assistance for Ukraine would not cause any problems. Russia and Israel would have no problems. According to Kremlin insiders, Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened to fire Medvedev, who still serves as vice chairman of the Russian Security Council. Following these discussions between Putin and Medvedev, it was revealed that Medvedev flew to the United States on a private plane. The surprise decision by Medvedev to visit America piqued everyone's interest. A few weeks following Medvedev's visit to the United States, it was revealed that the vast majority of recent anti-war and anti-Putin protests within Russian borders were organized and funded by Medvedev. Complicating matters even more, before we go into the specifics of the story, we'd like to clarify that we're working hard to get you the information we've gathered from credible sources and professional researchers as fast as possible. You may help us by clicking the Super Thanks button in response to this effort. The animosity between Dmitry Medvedev, Russia's president for many years, and Russian leader Vladimir Putin is higher than ever. Putin pushed Medvedev to quit many years ago, and he was replaced by Mikhail Mityushin, one of Vladimir Putin's most trusted officials. Medvedev, who had lost sight of Vladimir Putin, began to have numerous conflicts with him. It is just one of several disagreements in the ongoing struggle between Russia and Ukraine. Although Medvedev has been attempting to work with Putin for years, it is well known that he does not support Putin. Medvedev, who acted when Vladimir Putin began to attack Ukrainian territory, intended to use this predicament into an opportunity. US authorities, who were irritated by Vladimir Putin's aggressive actions and did not support Russia's military occupation of Ukrainian territory, devised a long-term secret plan to dethrone Putin by meeting privately with former Russian leader Dmitry Medvedev. Following these discussions between Medvedev and senior U.S. officials, the Russian intelligence service discovered that a bank account in Medvedev's name had been opened in the U.S. and that a considerable sum of money was coming into this account from an unknown source. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu was the first to respond when Medvedev was suspected of being paid by the U.S. Shoigu inquired in his address where the unrequited money going into Medvedev's account came from and what it was utilized for. Shoigu then accused former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev of treason, claiming that Medvedev was the worst thing that had ever happened to Russia. Russian authorities have begun to imply that Medvedev is the source of funding for the protests that have recently begun to occur very frequently within Russia's borders. Medvedev gives money to anti-Putin political organizations, allowing their members to organize anti-Putin protests across the country. If you pay closely, you will see that protests and sabotage within Russia's borders have recently escalated significantly. Russian officials claim that these measures were carried out to undermine Russian trust in Putin by instilling fear and panic among the Russian people. These protests in Russia have deeply troubled Vladimir Putin. Putin's attempt to repress these protests by arming Russian security forces resulted in the imprisonment of numerous Russian people. More than 20,000 Russian nationals are claimed to have been imprisoned in protests planned across Russia since the commencement of the war, with thousands also arrested. The major reason for the rapid growth of these anti-Putin protests is Putin himself. Following Russia's invasion of Ukrainian land, the Russian economy entered a period of extreme volatility as a result of sanctions and embargoes imposed on Russia by the United States and Western countries. Grocery prices and technical product prices both increased significantly when inflation rates rose. As a result of the withdrawal of several Western corporations from Russia, Russian individuals have begun to respond to the situation. People who want Russia to return to its former state began to demand that Vladimir Putin not only withdraw from Ukraine but also resign. Putin is becoming increasingly angry as he fears his authority is being undermined. But this was not the only thing that made Putin nervous. Putin, who was having difficulty recruiting soldiers for the Russian army, issued a partial mobilization decision months ago and forcibly recruited roughly 300,000 Russian civilians. Putin believed that by recruiting soldiers into the army, he would be able to advance his invasion of Ukrainian land much more quickly. But things did not go as planned. The vast bulk of the soldiers recruited by Vladimir Putin into the army were Russian minorities. Vladimir Putin purposefully sent these minorities residing in autonomous republics to fight on Ukrainian soil. This battle provided an obvious opportunity for Putin's assimilation program toward minority citizens, which he has been implementing for years. However, after a while, the minority people understood that the vast majority of soldiers in the army were chosen from among them. Following that, citizens in autonomous republics such as Crimea, Dagestan, and Chechnya began to organize anti-war demonstrations. However, Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, a close buddy of Vladimir Putin, was able to subdue the Chechen people. Not only did he quiet the Chechen people, but Chechnya also sent troops to Ukraine alongside the Russian army. On top of that, Chechen citizens' hatred for Ramzan Kadyrov has grown even stronger. Ramzan Kadyrov's decision to send Chechen forces to Ukrainian territory resulted in the deployment of independent Chechen soldiers. These independent soldiers serve alongside the Ukrainian army freely, whereas Ramzan Kadyrov army fights alongside the Russian army. In recent months, a news presenter infiltrated Ukrainian territory and conducted an exclusive interview with one of these volunteer Chechen troops. Volunteer Chechen troops stated in their statement that they do not support Vladimir Putin and Ramzan Kadyrov invasion of Ukrainian territory and will do everything in their power to end the Russian army's occupation of Ukrainian territory. At the same time, volunteer Chechen soldiers who have claimed that if they fail the Russian army in Ukraine, there will be a wonderful opportunity to end Ramzan Kadyrov rule will continue to fight with the Ukrainian army against Russian forces. A handful of Russian army personnel have recently opted to lay down their rifles on a regular basis in order to resist Putin. The minority of soldiers who claim that their fundamental necessities are not being provided and that Russian and Wagner soldiers treat them as second-class citizens are furious at Putin. Many military specialists believe that if the Russian army continues in this manner, it would lose the war and will be unable to recruit men. The shocking declaration came from North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, who has been a Russian ally since the Soviet era. Kim Jong-un has decided to sever ties with Russia. Has the U.S. administration meddled in North Korean-Russian relations? Russian President Vladimir Putin is losing allies one by one. When Russian President Vladimir Putin realized that he was losing control of Ukrainian land, he resumed negotiations with friendly countries. Putin, who had just met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, hoped to organize a meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. This time, the North Korean leader, however, declined Putin's invitation to this meeting. North Korea is ready to break its relations with Russia, according to a declaration made by Kim Jong-un. When the Russian army first began to capture Ukrainian territory in the first few months, it proceeded fairly quickly. The fact that Russia was both economically and militarily greater than Ukraine gave Russian forces a significant advantage. Despite this, the Ukrainian army put up a strong fight against the Russian forces as the United States and other Western countries began to give aid to Ukraine. The Ukrainian army began to acquire new and advanced military equipment. However, the assistance provided to Ukraine by countries such as the United States, Germany, and Poland, such as tanks, air defense systems, and long-range missiles, has made Russian President Vladimir Putin exceedingly worried with the military weapons it possesses. The Ukrainian army has become even more favorable and has greatly slowed Russian forces' advance in Ukraine. Putin, aware that withdrawing from Ukrainian land would be a shame to the entire world, sought to alleviate the load on himself by holding discussions with Russia's allies. Putin, who initiated negotiations with the Iranian government, obtained military supplies from Iran, including ammunition, weaponry, and unmanned warplanes. Jewel. The U.S. administration, on the other hand, has declared that the Russian military perpetrated war crimes on Ukrainian land using unmanned combat aircraft delivered by Iran, and that Iran is also a party in these crimes. US authorities successfully distanced the Iranian leadership from Putin by stating that Iran will be punished in international courts for war crimes perpetrated by Russia. However, Putin was aware that the Russian army was experiencing ammunition and weapon shortages, so he began talks with new allies. Putin's offer to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has been refused by Kim. Russian government officials were taken aback by Kim Jong-un's remarks on Russia. Putin, who had long sought to see North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, was aware that the North Korean army inventory included highly developed and technological weapons. Putin wanted to meet with North Korea, which he considered an ally, because he realized he could win the conflict in Ukraine much more easily if he drew North Korea to his side. The North Korean leader, however, declined Putin's invitation to this meeting. North Korea's rejection of this invitation for negotiations startled Kremlin officials. However, the most interesting aspect of the job was discovered afterwards. The North Korean intelligence service discovered that Russia has been assisting South Korea with weapons and ammunition for many years. North Korea and Russia have maintained a long-standing allied connection for many years. But the North Korean regime had only one condition for this alliance not to be terminated. There were also no arms transactions to countries officially identified as North Korea's foes. When North Korean intelligence discovered that the South Korean army was using Russian armaments and T-90 model tanks and relayed this knowledge with Kim Jong-un's stance toward Putin shifted dramatically. Kim Jong-un made scathing words regarding his relations with Russia. Shortly after this incident, Kim Jong-un stated that it is inappropriate for countries with allied connections with North Korea to provide military assistance to countries officially classified as North Korea's foes, and that they must temporarily decouple their military links with Russia. While North Korea and Russia maintain trade contacts, the two governments have decoupled military collaboration. However, it is claimed that the U.S. is also involved in the deconstruction of the North Korean-Russian alliance. As is well known, the U.S. administration is intervening in Russia's allies and imposing sanctions and embargoes. Iran is a prime example of this. In recent months, U.S. officials have said that if Iran continues to provide military equipment to Russia, the Iranian regime will be punished in international criminal courts. It is now thought that North Korea held a covert meeting with the U.S. as well. It is still uncertain whether North Korea, which has been working on nuclear weapons manufacture for many years, possesses a nuclear weapon. Despite the fact that Kim Jong-un has disseminated photographs of nuclear weapons on the internet, there is no information about the existence of these weapons. It is thought that the U.S. government has made an offer to North Korea to produce nuclear weapons. North Korea and the U.S. administration will work together to produce nuclear weapons under the supervision of the U.S. These weapons, however, would be placed in the location that the U.S. desired. The US's only stipulation in this offer was that North Korea discontinue its military collaboration with Russia. Many expert researchers have made such claims, but the actuality of the situation is still being debated. It's odd that North Korea abruptly terminated relations with Russia under the guise of Russia sending weapons and ammunition to South Korea. There appears to be no way for a regime like North Korea to be unaware that Russia has been selling weaponry to South Korea for quite some time. The collapse of North Korean military links with Russia has created widespread alarm in the Kremlin because Vladimir Putin believed that North Korea would support his invasion of Ukrainian territory. Actually, it was as well. Putin planned to reconstruct the areas he destroyed in Ukraine from the ground up with the help of North Korea. In the early months of the war, North Korea's leader stated that the country may work with Russia to restore the ravaged areas of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin had planned to reconstruct the devastated installations in Ukraine in a short period of time, but it appears that North Korea's request for assistance is no longer genuine. The Russian army has been occupying Ukrainian territory for more than a year, and the situation has worn Russia down. Although Vladimir Putin is unwilling to say it, the Russian army's situation on Ukrainian soil is dire. According to many specialist experts, more than half of Russia's army stockpile has been depleted, and Russia lacks the raw materials to create new weapons and ammunition. At the same time, according to information gathered from Kremlin-connected individuals, Vladimir Putin is having a tough time finding sources of funding for Russian military stationed on Ukrainian soil. As a result, the money in the state treasury is stated to have begun to be used, and the money in the treasury has been considerably reduced. In fact, dozens of incidents will confirm these assertions. As you may be aware, Vladimir Putin has always attempted to keep things civil between himself and the Russian billionaires who operate in Russia. Putin has now begun to approach these oligarchs for financial support for the Russian army. Russia is a well-known country in terms of oil and natural gas resources. Although Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened to cut off Europe's natural gas supply, he is equally aware that he must sell natural gas to Europe. If Russian President Vladimir Putin suspends natural gas and oil exports, a major source of funding for Russian forces on Ukrainian territory will be cut off. As a result, the Russian army will be obliged to withdraw from Ukrainian land. Whenever Vladimir Putin threatens Western countries with natural gas, many expert academics claim that Putin is bluffing and that natural gas cannot be cut off while the rest of the world is wondering when Russia and Ukraine's war will end. A new country has joined the fray. Japan has announced military equipment support for Ukraine, despite maintaining trade connections with Russia by exhibiting a neutral policy since the beginning of the war. The words made by Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida have created widespread consternation in the Kremlin. The occupying Russian forces on Ukrainian territory are in for a terrible time. The Russian army, which quickly resumed its acquisition of Ukrainian land in the early months of the war, was able to occupy various districts in Ukraine. Although the Ukrainian army provided excellent resistance to Russian forces in the early months of the war, the Russian army inventory was far superior to that of the Ukrainian army. However, with the assistance of the United States and Western countries, the Ukrainian army was able to obtain extremely advanced technological weaponry and equipment in a very short period of time. Japan has now announced that it will send military equipment support to the Ukrainian army. The long-standing issues between Russia and Japan have now erupted into a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. DEC decadence between Russia and Japan as is well known, is not so good. This conflict, which has lasted 77 years, began with Russia's conquest of Japan's Kuril Islands with the invasion of the Russian army in 1945. The Kuril Islands problem, which has recently arisen again, was considered Russian territory. The Japanese government, however, has not given up on these islands. This issue between Russia and Japan has flared into a huge crisis in recent weeks, with former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev visiting the Kuril Islands during his visit. Medvedev targeted Japan, stating that the Kuril Islands are Russian territory and that Russia is prepared to fight alongside Japan in the event of a danger. Shortly after Medvedev's words, 2 Russian Navy ships were dispatched to the Kuril Islands. However, Putin's naval ships went through the Kuril Islands and moved near Japan's maritime borders, along with the violation of Japan's maritime borders by Russian naval boats. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida issued a warning to Russian naval vessels to withdraw. Russian naval boats that had been violating Japan's maritime limits for a long time returned and anchored in the Kuril Islands. However, Russia's menacing move has enraged Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. The individual who stunned everyone with his speech criticized Russia's neutrality in the war and decided to supply tank and ammunition support to the Ukrainian army. In a statement, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida stated that Russia has invaded Ukraine's land as it has done to Japan, and that Putin has the potential to violate the borders of many more countries. According to the individual who stated that everyone should do something to halt Vladimir Putin's aggressive policy, Japan has begun working on this subject and has taken the first move to support Ukraine. The individual who addressed the Kuril Islands again in his statement noted that Russian naval boats were violating Japanese sea waters, which was unacceptable, and declared that a military support package would be provided to Ukraine soon. Japan will supply Type 90 tanks and Type 96 armored vehicles as part of its military assistance package. At the same time, weapons and ammunition used by the Japanese army will be transferred to the Ukrainian army. Kishida, who had initially pledged to supply 10 tanks and 8 armored vehicles, said that they would send a team of training officers to teach Ukrainian forces. This unit, which was dispatched to train Ukrainian soldiers in tank and weaponry, is made up of 80 Japanese soldiers. Japan has declared that in addition to delivering military weapons to Ukraine due to Vladimir Putin's hostile actions, commercial relations between Russia and Japan will be overhauled in December. The Japanese shipment, which is set to leave in the next weeks, is scheduled to arrive in Ukraine in 2 or 3 weeks. These declarations made by Japan immediately made their way onto the global agenda following Japanese Prime Minister Kishida's words. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked Japan and urged Kishida to visit Ukraine. The introduction of Japanese tanks in Ukraine will significantly strengthen the Ukrainian army's inventory. Vladimir Putin has yet to make a statement regarding Japan's assistance to Ukraine. However, according to information gathered from Kremlin-connected sources, a decision on a meeting was recently taken. The battle between Russia and Ukraine, which has lasted more than a year, is no longer taking place between the two countries. Both governments began acquiring allies for themselves. Ukraine, which fought alone at the start of the conflict, eventually gained the help of the United States and Western countries and began to employ far more technological and contemporary armaments. Russia is well known for being larger than Ukraine, both militarily and economically. However, thanks to Ukraine's allies, the situation between the Ukrainian and Russian armies appears to have been decoupled. When Russian President Vladimir Putin realized his army was losing the war on Ukrainian land, he began supplying troops and ammunition from allied countries. Putin is attempting to alleviate the burden on himself by supplying troops and munitions from nations including Assyria, Belarus, and especially Iran. The Iranian government, which has close ties with Russia, is one among the countries backing the Russian army in this conflict. The Iranian government has been accused of supplying unmanned combat planes and weapons to Russia on numerous occasions. The Russian military used unmanned combat aircraft purchased from Iran to assault civilian areas on Ukrainian territory. Juil. Putin, unable to obtain the success he desired through ground operations, began to concentrate on airstrikes. The great bulk of these airstrikes were carried out using unmanned combat aircraft supplied by Iran. However, the Russian army has begun to perpetrate war crimes by using unmanned warplanes to bomb not only the Ukrainian army, but also residential areas in Ukraine. This infuriated Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian president called on international forces to punish Vladimir Putin. Zelensky, who is suing Putin in criminal court with proof, is attempting to establish that Putin committed war crimes. However, the United States was the first country to intervene in Russia's war crimes. The U.S. government has put Iranian authorities to sleep by threatening them with prosecution in international criminal courts if they continue to sell unmanned war aircraft to Russia. Furthermore, the Iranian government issued a statement claiming that the Shad 136 model Iranian-made jets deployed by Russia were supplied to Russia prior to the commencement of the war, and that no military equipment was provided to Russia after the start of the war. The Israeli authorities, however, refuted Iran's accusations. As is well known, Iran and Israel have been engaged in a long-running shadow war. As a result, the Israeli government has established a special unit within the Israeli intelligence service to monitor Iran's every move. According to this Israeli intelligence team, many cargo planes belonging to the Russian Defense Ministry entered Iran's borders empty. These empty cargo planes were flying back to Russia with cargo from Iran. According to Israeli officials, Iran is still quietly supporting Russia, and unmanned combat aircraft and mercenaries are carried aboard cargo flights. As a result, it became clear that Iran is still secretly supporting Russia. Syria is Russia's other ally. When Vladimir Putin discovered that Russian forces on Ukrainian land were arriving insufficiently, he began to withdraw Russian soldiers from his military headquarters in Syria and transfer them to fight on Ukrainian territory. However, Russian forces stationed in Syria reacted angrily to Putin's request. Russian soldiers who were at ease in Syria were aware that they were being sent to their deaths on Ukrainian soil. But he also knew that they couldn't defy Putin's directives. By this point, 4 Russian bases in Syria had been closed and Russian troops had been transferred to Ukrainian territory. Polish tanks have begun to appear on Ukrainian soil. Polish tanks, which successfully halted the Russian army's advance in Ukraine, dealt a significant blow to the Russian army. Ukrainian military were able to repel the Russian army in Zaporizhzhia using tanks delivered by Poland. In the continuing deconfliction between Russia and Ukraine, some intriguing developments are taking place when comparing Russia with Ukraine. It is commonly recognized that Russia is a larger country, both economically and militarily. As a result, when Russia initially invaded Ukraine, it was able to quickly capture several sections of the country. However, the Ukrainian army has impressed practically every country in the globe with its example of resistance. Russian President Vladimir Putin intended to complete his invasion of Ukraine and absorb Ukrainian land into Russia as soon as possible. However, the United States and other Western countries were able to derail Putin's scheme with the war's rising severity. Various countries began to contribute military supplies to the Ukrainian army. With these contributions, the Ukrainian army's arsenal has grown to include more sophisticated and advanced weapons when it comes to countries that donate aid to Ukraine. Poland is at the top of the list after the Russian army began to overrun Ukrainian territory. The vast majority of Ukrainian citizens who had been forced to flee began to be resettled within the borders of Poland. Together with the Polish government's decision, the visa issue for Ukrainian citizens wishing to settle in Poland has been resolved as a result. Ukrainian citizens were free to cross the Polish border whenever they pleased. Furthermore, the Polish government, which gives financial resources to Ukrainian citizens, has alleviated the financial hardships of a huge number of Ukrainian citizens. The Polish government has also been one of Ukraine's most vocal allies. Poland, which has been supplying weaponry and ammunition to the Ukrainian army from the beginning of the conflict, delivered numerous tanks to Ukraine as part of its final decision. Now, utilizing these tanks, Ukrainian soldiers have launched a massive operation against the occupying Russian forces, repulsing the Russian army and the seized Zaporizhzhia region. Before we get into the specifics of the news, we'd like to remind you that we're working hard to provide actual news to you as soon as possible, and that you can help us by clicking the super thank you button. For a long time, the Russian army has occupied many cities in the Zaporizhzhia area where the fighting is still raging. Shortly after agreeing to deliver Leopard tanks to Ukraine, Germany sent German-made Leopard tanks used in Poland to the Ukrainian army. After a long period of inaction, the Ukrainian army launched action to liberate the Zaporizhzhia region from Russian domination. In this operation, the Ukrainian army employed Leopard 2 tanks provided by Poland to liberate the border towns of the Zaporizhzhia area. In July, a Ukrainian contingent of 2,000 soldiers and 11 Leopard tanks came into the Zaporizhzhia area. The Ukrainian soldiers that made it to Salon, one of Zaporizhzhia border towns, arranged a reconnaissance fly using a drone to determine the number of Russian soldiers stationed there. The Ukrainian army moved to commence the operation after detecting the buildings where Russian soldiers were stationed in the town with a tiny drone. The Leopard tanks, which can fire from a considerable distance, and the Ukrainian forces who kept the buildings where the Russian soldiers were stationed with an artillery range targeted the town structures one by one. Surprisingly, the Russian forces abandoned the buildings where they were stationed and formed a defensive position to safeguard the town. Ukrainian soldiers proceeded steadily towards the town's entrance, accompanied by Leopard tanks. After hours of combat, the Russian forces who had run out of ammo recognized they couldn't stop the Ukrainian army's onslaught. The vast majority of Russian soldiers stationed in town fled, while 82 Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian army. According to reports, more than 60 Russian servicemen were killed as a result of the operation. Interrogated Russian soldiers confessed to Ukrainian commanders that there were more than 600 Russian soldiers in town. As a result, the number of Russian soldiers that fled the town is estimated to be around 460. A town in the Zaporizhzhia region was liberated from Russian occupation many years later as a result of this operation coordinated by the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army's achievement was greeted with a standing ovation by members of the Ukrainian parliament. The Ukrainian army, which repelled Russian forces in the early months of the war, is now on the offensive rather than the defensive. Zelensky, who declared that they would liberate the territories captured by the Russian army on Ukrainian territory one by one, appears to have begun the operations he promised. The Ukrainian army, which has initiated operations in 3 different regions of Ukraine, including Zaporizhzhia, is not looking at Russian soldiers in the recent week. The Ukrainian Air Force has undertaken 3 air operations against Russian soldiers. Ukrainian military used Bayraktar unmanned combat aircraft given by Turkey to conduct an air attack on Russian army ammunition stockpiles and a secret Russian headquarters in the Kharkiv region. The Ukrainian military flew an unmanned combat aircraft reconnaissance mission to the Kharkiv region, which is close to Ukraine's border with Russia. Along with the discovery, Russian forces were discovered to have converted a hospital in Kharkiv into a secret Russian base. The Russian army has previously been known to have converted tall and expansive structures into headquarters in the places it occupies. The Ukrainian army took action after discovering that the hospital was being used as a base by Russian soldiers using 6 unmanned combat aircraft. Ukrainian Air Forces conducted an air operation at this secret site where Russian soldiers are stationed. The Russian armored vehicles stationed surrounding the hospital were seriously damaged during the operation. The Russian soldiers, taken aback by what they had witnessed during the Ukrainian army's raid, immediately exited the medical building. According to Ukrainian government officials, the amount of Russian army troop losses during this operation is unknown. Russian President Vladimir Putin has recently expressed concern about airstrikes targeting the Russian military. The Russian military's bombings on Ukrainian territory began to fail after the U.S. government provided long-range HIMARS missiles and Patriot air defense systems to the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian President Zelensky is even conducting air operations within Russian borders in order to terrify Vladimir Putin. As a result, Vladimir Putin increased security measures. Russian President Vladimir Putin has begun deploying air defense systems to strategic locations in order to protect the lands he has taken in Ukraine on Putin's orders. Security measures in the illegally acquired territories of Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, Luhansk, and Donetsk have begun to be reinforced, according to information gathered from regional sources in recent weeks. A considerable number of air defense systems have been transferred to Ukrainian territory from within Russian borders. This rail shipment is thought to have held a huge quantity of air defense systems as well as weapons and ammunition. A major agenda occurred for the citizens of the region when the Russian supply train took photographs and published them on social media. The U.S. government has stated that it is preparing for Russia to launch another strike on Ukrainian territory. Vladimir Putin has transferred a substantial number of troops and air defense equipment to Belarus in recent months. The delivery of these weapons and ammunition to Belarus drew a great deal of attention. The Ukrainian General Staff claimed that if Vladimir Putin learned of this intelligence, he would launch a military offensive on Ukrainian territory via Belarus borders. However, in a statement, Vladimir Putin stated that there would be no strikes and that Russia and Belarus would conduct a joint military exercise. However, Putin dispatched far too many air defense systems, bombs, and weaponry for routine military practice. According to information gathered by Ukrainian intelligence, some Russian soldiers stationed on Ukrainian soil have also begun to be transferred to the Belarusian border. As a result, the accusations that Russia will strike Ukraine through Belarus proved to be quite realistic.